Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The free world has been moved by the courage of the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong in the face of increased repression and Chinese government meddling. It's appalling that thousands of protesters in Hong Kong have been persecuted for fighting for liberties that Americans enjoy. The national security law imposed on Hong Kong by the Chinese Communist Party has enabled the ruthless abuse of protesters, political leaders, journalists, and teachers. Despite its name, the national security law is not about security, but fear. Fear of the voices in Hong Kong calling for reform, democracy, and freedom. I'll continue to push the leadership of China to respect democracy. I believe my colleagues on both sides of the aisle share my feelings about the crisis in Hong Kong. The question is, what are we going to do about it? As I've said many times, the Judiciary Committee should be about legislation, not lamentation. I was proud to co-sponsor the bipartisan Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which became law last year. This legislation, produced by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, requires sanctions against officials responsible for human rights violations in Hong Kong, sends an important message of bipartisan support from Congress to those who are aspiring to democracy in Hong Kong. But what about the Judiciary Committee? I'm proud to co-sponsor the Rubio-Menendez Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act, granting refugee status to Hong Kong residents at risk of persecution. That bill was introduced 6 months ago and referred to this committee. Why aren't we taking action on it? Last week, the House of Representatives passed related legislation, the bipartisan Hong Kong People's Freedom and Choice Act, which would grant TPS to Hong Kong residents currently in the U.S. and provide refugee status to Hong Kongers facing persecution. We could take up this legislation today, on the floor of the Senate, and send it to the President's desk to be signed into law. We can't ignore the reality that when we speak of refugees, the policy of the Trump administration on refugees is a dramatic departure from what we have done since World War II. Since the enactment of the Refugee Act of 1980, for example, the United States has resettled an average of 80,000 refugees per year. However, in the midst of the worst refugee crisis in the history of the world, the Trump administration has set record low refugee admission targets 4 years in a row, culminating in the lowest level of refugees in history, 15,000. How many refugees has the United States admitted from Hong Kong in the last year? 0, not one. The Trump administration has also decimated legal protections for Hong Kongers and other innocent victims of persecution who flee to our borders. For example, under a new rule issued last week, Hong Kongers could be denied asylum if they transit other countries on their way to the United States, if their persecutors detain them for only brief periods, or if their persecutors were not able to carry out their threats before the asylum seeker fled to the United States. The administration's reactions do not evidence support for the Hong Kong democracy movement. They only punish innocent victims of persecution who pose no threat to our security and have turned to America for safety. We must reverse refugee and asylum restrictions that harm those who have been persecuted. We must restore America's stature as a beacon for those fleeing persecution, whether they're from Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, Syrians, Venezuelans, or Rohingya. America is stronger when we live up to the ideals we represent to the world. I yield.